Yeah, thank you so much, Farrell, for having me. So I'm Seem, and I've been in the whole social media game, so to say, for the past 11 years. My primary focus has always been on data and analytics and trying to weave in earned, paid, and owned social, and also look at the overall marketing strategy. So that's kind of my career, so to say. In Brand Hero, what I do is it's a bit of a side project whereby people that are really keen to learn more about influencer marketing, I think, can take a more serious look at it. And I've just recently done an online course which everybody can get access to. But other than that, a lot of my daily work is spent with Google consumer marketing, whereby I consult, measure, and optimize big consumer-facing campaigns for search, for Pixel, for other Google consumer products.
Thank you for that. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for agreeing to do this. I think we tried to arrange this over the last, I think, 3-4 weeks, and I'm glad that we managed to knock down the time. So I think on the topic, I think the topic for today would be, of course, in terms of influencer marketing, right? And maybe as a start, maybe you could talk a little bit about, since you've been doing this for 11 years, as you said, how has it changed over the years, in terms of the trends, so to speak?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and thanks for bringing it up. So when I started, it feels like a long time ago, but I'm mindful there's a lot more seasoned experts, and I believe you as well. So in 2009, it was a lot about forums. YouTube was around, but obviously Facebook wasn't. There was no Instagram in sight, and I think the situation was a lot more scattered. It wasn't so much dominated by single platforms. Over time, what's happened is that, a lot of the usage has revolved around these big platforms. So you have a lot of users on Instagram, a lot of users on Facebook and YouTube, and now you have TikTok, and that's where a lot of the energy has flown. I think a lot of, that's been the primary change. The second big change, at least in the influencer scene, was that in the beginning it was a lot about bloggers. I think blogger outreach, and we have also a couple of companies in Southeast Asia that came out, like Nafnang, and there was a few other kind of like early companies that started bringing these dots together. But I think the big change, and the fact that we're talking about this now, is probably thanks to Instagram, that started to take shape in around 2011, and from there onwards it really became an industry, because previously, before that, the number of people that actually were able to survive and make money and live as a creative artist, as a YouTuber, for example, or as a blogger, were very few in numbers. But that changed dramatically when Instagram came.
Right. I mean, we obviously, Asia being different from the rest of the world. Would you say that, that is in a way leading the way, or is it still following what the West is curating in terms of, trends or whatnot?
I think Asia is definitely leading the way. I think that as a region, it's so much diverse, and I think there's two notable countries that certainly are on top of my mind, and obviously China is one of them, whereby the industry has become so much more mature and so much more varied than, I don't think it even there's not even a close second anywhere in the world. You have companies that, for example, are like specialist talent agencies that take people that look great generally from smaller places, and they work with them as if a modeling agency would work in Brazil, and then they bring them up, teach them all sorts of behaviors, and obviously also how to look great on camera, and those eventually become our live streamers. You have all sorts of supporting structures when it comes to financing companies that offer different credit systems. For example, when you're selling live stream content, then you can offload that to someone else while the transactions are being done. You have a wide variety of very interesting companies and services. And the mere fact that I think TikTok just recently announced that they're actually, after ambitiously hiring, I believe, 100,000 influencers to their own company, basically selling and live streaming content, is a fact, and kind of, I think, a magnitude that is very hard to compare with anybody else. The second market that I would probably Note in APAC is Japan. I think they do also very, very interesting things, especially in the gaming and anime scene that is very hard to compare to anybody else. US obviously also is very rich and varied, but I think, to be honest, no one comes close to China at this stage.
Understandably, but I would assume that even countries like Indonesia, because of the high internet penetration and also the number of phones, that they are also kind of, would you say, paving the way in terms of content or the types of content?
I think so. I think it's certainly changed a lot over the years.
Yeah.
Now we have a lot more access, and
Yeah.
and I think just quantitatively, the number of people, even in Malaysia, Singapore, also close by where we stay, has significantly improved. Phones are cheaper,
Yeah.
the gear is cheaper. People know how to create better content. I think quality has become cheaper. So you're probably right on that one. I think here in our neck of the woods, it tends to be, I see gamers being very active. I think the classic kind of like lifestyle influencer, so to say, who just shows off their wonderful curves is I think less like
Really?
is a little bit less frequent. Like we still have that, but I think like when we just look at, when we look at the variety and I think the different, like it's also I think very cultural. Like you don't necessarily, you don't do that in an Indonesian or a Malaysian culture, I think, so that easily.
They do, but they're a bit more discreet, I guess. It depends on who you talk to, I guess.
I think so, yeah.
Right. So of course, moving moving forward from that, obviously there are different sorts of influencers that do different things across the region, right? So like maybe I'll select say Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Southeast Asia, for example. Are there particular types of influencers that do better than others? So for example, lifestyle influencers, some people are maybe more mom and pop driven, some maybe more into like health and wellness like yoga, some more into food. But are there particular trends that are strong within these sort of regions like Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and say Singapore?
I think there's a number of trends here. We just recently actually, I finished the report on comparing 6 markets, UK, US, Australia, and then Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia. So 6 markets altogether, and we looked at 900 different influencers, and we looked at the top kind of tier only because there's a wide variety. One thing we noticed, I think generally speaking, that sort of like lifestyle category is really the biggest one. The reason why I'm quoting it is because it is hard to pin down and say that this is the only thing that person does. Like in Malaysia, for example, you think about someone like Jen Chia, for example, she does a lot, the variety of what she does, goes on trips with AirAsia or does some beauty thing and sings at the same time and then partners with Samsung and all these kind of things. They're like it's she is a person, right? Like she is a character having that charisma and having that personality. So I think that but I have to say also that package in itself is really rare. Like very often you would start from a more, I would say, narrower segment, so to say. And to be honest, the ones that really try to appeal on many different fronts, I haven't seen being that necessarily successful. Like, for example, and also success is something that we need to define with this context, because very often what's been looked at is obviously engagement numbers, but in reality, we all know running businesses that's not why business exists. They want to have sales, they want to have customer engagement on a more profound way than just measuring likes and comments. And I think that's also important. Like, for example, with a very recent, I shouldn't tell the name, but of a big TV actor in Indonesia who has over 30 million followers on Instagram.
30 million.
30 million, yes, that's right, over 30 million, and she's very widely she's widely known, celebrity status, does a lot of personal content. But whenever you put that next to each other of a brand post that she does, so she partners with brands occasionally, then you see a massive delta, meaning that the difference between an engagement rate of a regular post and a branded post is so off that it just clearly shows that she either doesn't have interest or doesn't know how to take a marketer's or a communications brief and then distill that into something relevant for the audience. So she's clearly like, well, possibly doesn't care. I'm not sure. She doesn't need the money, definitely. That's for sure. So those are the challenges, I think, when you talk about the different types. Generally speaking, the celebrity statuses, I think in our region, they still struggle with social media at large. Like they a lot of them have built their presence in TV or in traditional outlets, and I think the ones that are successful in social tend to be a little bit different, more rough around the edges, more UGC driven, more, I think, sincere, possibly also. And our data clearly shows that the kind of this, it varies a bit by market, but the ones that perform the best are not the top tier. Is usually the second or kind of the third bracket, whereby we see the best engagement and reach at the same time. So we did a multiplication of looking at the maximum amount of reach and also the maximum amount of engagement that you can have, and that was kind of the finding. But in terms of categories, that sort of, even though that sort of lifestyle category is the most popular one, then I think certain segments are more natural for influencers than others. Like people, for example, that are dealing with marketing beauty products, obviously is very natural choice. Cooking, food and beverage. I think hospitality used to be a big one. Travel used to be a big one. Now things have changed a lot. But the gaming is a big one. Consumer electronics is a big one, certainly. So I think certain audiences will define whether influencers is a good choice. But one of the points that I always bring out is that influencers is not for everybody. And I think you're also asking that question with that same intent, that it's not for every brand. It is for a brand that is able to embrace the fact that you have to be open to a certain degree, because you're kind of giving your brand to another party, and you need to accept the fact that there is a potential risk related to it. It always carries that risk whenever you deal with kind of earned social media, and we just have to accept that. And so those are my 2 cents usually on the categorization and what seems to be the landscape.
Well, you've kind of touched some of the questions that I will probably ask you again in the next, in a couple of minutes. But I think we talked a little bit about influencers, lifestyle, etc. And I think you touched about it a little bit. But what, in your opinion, what makes a good influencer? Would you say that it's charisma, the ability to create content? Is it the ability to connect to people? And and moving forward, if I'm in a brand, or how do I go about finding these sort of like diamond in the rough if they're not popular already?
Yeah.
For example.
So those are very, very good questions, and so the first one, first of all, like what defines influence, I think, is something that I spent quite a lot of time on when I did the course, when I put the course material together. I found a lot of inspiration from sales for some reason, because salespeople generally they go into a lot of psychology and they try to figure out, like, what are my ins and outs and so on. But all of that, to be honest, like all that body of research that I did, distilled into this one point that I think is the best descriptor in social, and I called it the entertainment value. Means that the person, even though when you look at Instagram, you see a lot of beautiful bodies, male and female, all sorts of different ways of how it's being exposed. But I think there's also the other side of the story, which is a lot of people that are just very creative, and they're not necessarily good looking. So I think that myth that you need to be good looking to be successful is actually not true. I think it's more that the good looking people probably are just more self-confident. They just are okay with putting themselves out there because they've got enough rapport throughout their lifetime that they're good looking.
Right.
But I think that the fact that we have, Zach King, for example, who is he's an average dude, but is amazingly creative, videos on TikTok, and he started as a wine influencer. And you have a row of other examples, people that are in the LGBT communities, all sorts of different colors. And I think that is also the beauty of social media, is that it doesn't kind of discriminate, or it doesn't select like the TV channel might. And this is one point of it, is the entertainment value, and what are you getting out as an audience? Are you enjoying looking at it? A good test for me personally that I found is that if this topic is, for example, unboxing. I've watched a fair amount of unboxing videos.
Even my niece likes watching unboxing stuff. Sorry.
Right. So watching unboxing videos, right? It's a category that I don't think nobody grew up thinking that I'd love to know more about unboxing. You know, I think but if you look at the good ones, if you look at, like, for example, Unboxing Theory, and you look at the other ones, those are videos, and a lot of times you would share with your spouse, or you would share with your friend, even if they're not into that category. And I think that's what makes a really good influencer, is that they have the ability to creatively take a challenge and make it so entertaining and so widespread that it just captures your audience, your attention. So that's I think is that sort of magic component of it. Of course, how it reflects in data is that you have a very high engagement rate, meaning that your audience is very active. And when we look at how do you then select influencers, then increasingly what we've done is to obviously look at the reach of the audience, but more importantly, look at what is the composition of that audience, meaning that what's the demographics of that, where are they based. Like, a good thing always to check as the first thing is how many people are actually based in that country you're interested with, or that territory. That's the first test we do. And then, of course, engagement rate. And then increasingly, also recently, we've done pretty much to every, the research piece that I also mentioned earlier. For all of these, we also ran an additional test whereby we look at the kind of the healthiness of that audience, because increasingly over the past few years, it's become very easy to buy engagement. So you have kind of a counter movement of companies that want to exploit that industry and offer you a very cheap click farm solution to boost your engagement. And actually, we found several influencers like that also in Malaysia and some other countries, and we've publicized that content on our blog. And it is unfortunately very widespread. So for marketers and communications professionals, the first thing to do is to check whether there is a pattern for buying fake engagement, which seems very widespread. It's, by the way, it's very cheap. It literally starts, the last time I checked, with a few bucks already, like literally with a few dollars, you can already start buying click farm traffic. So it is quite crazy. So for that reason, it is important to look at those kind of like what we call hygiene metrics. But at the end of the day, once all that data stuff is done and you're kind of convinced that, okay, this person might be suitable, then the last checkpoint is still, is this someone who embodies the values of my brand? And that is, I feel, kind of the litmus test of whether that person will be then either chosen or not. Everything else is kind of leading up to that point, I feel.
Right. I think you kind of like touched my next question. I guess you talked about rate of engagement, etc. Would you say there's this always age-old debate that rate of engagement is more important than the followers itself? Would you agree?
So this is interesting. The question actually comes from, it is a bit outdated. I think that's the short answer to it, because these days it is far more important that I know that the audience is engaging than the reach. And the simple reason for it is because as a marketer, the influencer part of it is just tiny piece in the budget. And the way how to approach influencers is that they're your creative partners, but the distribution strategy with this content. And this is a very strong point that I'm also making in the course, is has to be done within the brand. You can't be lazy enough to think that, okay, let's just offload my sales targets and everything to this influencer, and then hope for the best, right? So that very often a lot of marketers come with these sort of questions that how do I track sales? And I did this market influencer campaign and you didn't get sales. I'm like, well, but what did you expect? Like we know from the past 2012 was the drastic decrease of organic reach in Facebook. So we knew that ever since then, basically, organic reach, normal organic reach is 1 to 2%. Meaning that if you have 1 million likes on your Facebook page, then realistically 1 to 2% of these people will see anything that you put out there.
Right.
So there's no way how the influencer can bypass these rules. They work in the same territory, they work with the same platforms, so they also have the same barriers that we have as marketers. So our role is to be responsible to our targets and to treat them as such. And for that reason, there's really a couple of ways how you can, what I call, amplify those stories. Because the influencers provide you kind of like testimonials or content that they feel is very personal. Now your role is to figure out whether you want to reach a wider audience through social, or you actually take that piece of content and you put it on a website, or you distribute it through PR or other means. Is really up to you, but it's really that sort of synergy that needs to come together, because otherwise you will not see those results.
Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. Obviously there you mentioned that you have to make sure that you understand a person's sort of like the influencer's audience in order to make sure that you create the right sort of content and how it is to be curated. But is there sort of like a tactic, or is there a way for you to make sure that your branded content or your branded post will be well received? I know it's a very pedestrian question, but like from a brand standpoint, I've done my research. I understand that this person may be right for me, and I know for a fact that as you mentioned before about this Indonesian actress, branded content versus normal content, the engagement rate is very different. And if I'm a branded person, how do I make sure that my branded content may not necessarily be as high in terms of like reach as her normal content, but is strong enough for it to be deemed a relative success, for lack of a better word. Yeah.
I think it's a very valid question. I would, if you have never done as a brand marketer or as a marketer, you've never done influencer marketing, then I think the first step is really to do a pilot, and that pilot does not need to be a kind of a 1 or a 0, that you don't have to spend your whole year's worth of budget on it, but rather take an approach of selecting carefully 10 influencers, for example, and then kind of over measuring those results, everything that you literally can. And I think with that sort of approach, the learning is very strong, and chances are that by the end of that pilot, you'll have a very good idea what is more suitable and what not. Usually the audience is also very, I would say, straightforward and direct in social media. So if you what I usually say, that their bullshit radar is very advanced and merciless, because if you start faking it, or it doesn't fit the brand, somehow the story is disconnected, or the person doesn't embody those sort of values, then I think people will point it out very quickly to you. It's really about testing.
And I think this leads to my sort of like my next question, which is the fact that as I'm of the belief that when you engage an influencer, you want them to be as comfortable with their audience. I mean, I would assume that they know their audience better than you, and therefore they know what they're looking for. And I think, in my personal opinion, if I work with an influencer, of course, as an agency, I know exactly what I need to do for my clients' campaigns, for example. But I wouldn't want to dictate how the words in which these campaigns are to be curated. The words, like for the text, for their postings to be curated, because I want it to be natural. Is there sort of like what is your take on it? Do you still find that clients demand or require things to be a bit more hard sell because they want to see that it leads to sales, directly or indirectly?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think there's two jobs to be done. I think my personal opinion, based on all the analysis that I've done, is that the influencer's value is more on what we usually call a brand campaign. Brand campaigns are unlike direct response campaigns. Their objective usually kind of ends with intent, meaning that you have your top line numbers, your impressions, and your reach, and whatever else you might have. But in the end of the day, kind of the bottom line of that campaign is whether people are more likely to engage with your brand in a business meaningful way that tomorrow than they were yesterday, right? So that is, and my experience is that when you impose a very direct response type of campaign dynamic to a influencer, they often struggle with it. And the reason for my best guess is that, number one, they're not really good salesmen, most of them. And number two, the way how they have built their audience is exactly that sort of storytelling, which is exactly brand marketing, right? You're telling stories that have this sort of personal look and feel, and they're engaging, and that's the reason why the audience comes to them. But they're not really shoving anything down anybody's throat. And I think that's the story. There's some exceptions, like for example, the unboxing exception, I think is an exception, because there you're literally featuring products, and then there is a kind of a direct response element there embedded. But I think a lot of the other categories, there is that sort of sweet spot is something that needs to be found. My personal experience again is that influencers are better at telling stories, unless they're doing product reviews. I think they're better at telling stories, and what I suggest usually to marketers is to take the influencer part of your campaign and use that as the storytelling platform to get the attention, to get the emotion across your audience, and then activate the direct response layer where you can have sales results, or you can have app installs or anything else of that nature in a paid fashion. So you take that asset and you literally create an ad out of it. Like that's usually what I suggest. And that would mean that you get the assets, you get the rights, you sign a basic contract, and that's really it. And the funnel of these sort of campaigns would look like such that you would engage a lot of influencers, but eventually what you choose to do direct response activations with is a handful. And you can test that, and you can see how the content performs. And then based on that data, you can say that, you know what, from these 20 influencers we engaged, we're going to choose these two, and they will be kind of our cover girls and boys for our direct response campaign efforts. And that is what a good marketer would do, because that's the not lazy approach of assuming that the influencer will do your job. So that's what I would advocate, and I think that's how good campaigns have seen very good results.
Right. When you say good results, what in terms of it translates to a particular sale, right? If you were to select these, say, two people, and you were to work with them.
So even with brand campaigns, even if the short-term metric is intent, then on the long term, obviously the brand equity has to result to some form of monetizable value. And I think the best example of that could be, it's much being talked about, but Daniel Wellington, you know, how it like started from a $30,000 company to hundreds of millions of dollars, and now they're opening their own shops in Singapore, and I'm not sure if they've done in Malaysia, but I'm sure that's in the cards as well.
Yeah, everywhere.
So they started with influencer marketing. Their whole premise was built on influencer marketing, and the only thing they did is to say that here's my watch, please feature it in your pictures, and then add this coupon code. Is that going to work today? I have some doubts, because it's 2020 and they started in 2011, but because I think people are a little bit jaded of the same dynamic, but who knows? But the fact of the matter is that they, because of that sort of big micro engagement, and they just literally typing away in Instagram and searching for good pictures and people that can take them, and having a bit of reach, and then giving them the watches was the bedrock of their business and how they grew it. There's several case studies about it. I'm also talking about that in the course, but I think that there is something to learn from there. And what's interesting with them is that when you look at, I'm not sure if that's the case now, but just a couple of months ago, when you look at their website from China or from, I looked at Singapore, I looked at a couple of other markets, you will see an influencer that is kind of catered to that region, right? So your front kind of landing page will change based on that, and it will show not a big celebrity, but actually someone of an influencer. I think that's very interesting with Daniel Wellington and how they've built their strategy. I think again, 2020 strategies need to be a little bit different,
right?
But that's kind of the fun of marketing and comms, right? It
Exactly.
always keeps on changing.
Exactly. So well, it's okay. So back to the list of questions. I think you may have touched this a bit earlier in our conversation, but we, like with my clients especially, we tend to work with different types of sizes. Whether they're SMEs, whether they're MNCs, local or international. And for some of the products are very B2B, some are B2C. So we work with a mixture of both micro and macro influencers. But I would assume that you do that as well. But maybe from your experience, how would you, as a as an expert or a person who's experienced, give us an idea on how to determine which ones to leverage on, for example. Maybe give us a scenario on the type of a product or brand that you could use a micro or a macro, or ones where you can put both together to get the kind of desired sort of like reach and also engagement, so to speak.
Sorry, I'm just going to pause here a moment. Is there any background noise that you can hear?
It was very slight.
Okay,
it was okay.
I think someone's drilling in the courtyard.
It's okay. I can't hear it. It's okay. Do you want me to? Okay, I can ask the questions again.
No, I got the question. I can answer it.
Sure.
So when it comes to choosing influencers, I think the first thing that we want to reflect back on is the end result that we seek to get. That end result is really, I think, is a cross section of two things. Number one is, what do I think will be the most authentic and best type of story that my brand can have, right? So you're trying to picture in the back of your head, what's the testimonial that I'm after? What's the trust that I want to build with my audience? I think that's the first consideration that I would have. Arguably, if you go down the ladder of the ladder of reach, so to say, I think what we classify as the type Bs and the Cs, and the classification, by the way, in our case differs by market, but you're talking about people that have a couple of 100,000 followers. So they're not that small, but they're still kind of like small enough to have a conversation, right? So they're not usually, they don't have an army of agents, for example, etc. So you can have a real world conversation with them. And I think that with those people, especially if you haven't done influencer marketing before, you'll have a lot of value by just finding out what is that sort of sweet spot between their audience and your product. Like what's the story that you want to tell? And so I think that's the first consideration that I would have. The second consideration that I would have is the audience that they also come with, which is obviously incredibly important, because that also determines my decision making, whether I will choose this or the other influencer. So I think those are the two things that I would personally look at. So when we think about different types of brands, then number one is that if you're a small brand, if you're an SMB or you're maybe a medium-sized brand, but you don't have a big marketing budget, then the first thing that I would think of is that, okay, I know that influencers are being listened more than my ads, right? I know that already. That's kind of like, let's put that topic aside, and we know that it has an effect on the audience that I care about. So once you've established that fact, then the question is, are there basically gifts or like product examples that I can share with the influencers in the hopes that they would actually genuinely talk about it? a very important part about this is that the genuinity or the authenticity can only come from real world experience. You have to touch it, you have to feel it, you have to maybe experience the product. So I would say that sending those sort of samples en masse is, or at least to a wide variety of individuals, is something that I would seriously do in the first out of it. And very often for companies, it's also more cost efficient to send those samples to people rather than start paying everybody. The other thing about the big influencers obviously is that everybody wants to get their cut, including the agents and everybody else involved in that system. So that means the higher up you go, the more you need to pay. The second thing that is often not being talked about is that, and I think the product sample approach is something a lot of brands already do. But there's the second part that is very important is that, you see, when influencers talk about anything, and you can relate to this better than anybody, is that they think kind of like an editor, right? They think about what is talking worthy to me, to my audience, and what is something that they will want to talk about. And when you put that hat on, then it's really when you think about as a marketer what you can do with influencers, then it's really about experiences that you cannot buy. Right, and that's something that I would ask myself as a brand owner or a business owner or as a marketer, is what are the experiences that I can give a handful of these individuals that kind of represent the audience that I want to reach? What are the experiences that I can give that you cannot have access to? Is there maybe a production line that is specifically interesting in terms of how we produce our things? Or is there any part of how the magic in our company is created that we would want to bring out? So there's variety of different examples. Like, for example, in Google very recently, I love how the data and the trust aspect was brought out by bringing individuals, which is very hard to do, actually bringing individuals to a data center. There's other examples that has been done in the region whereby, for example, the handful of influencers has been back in the pre-COVID days, is flown into Japan, for example, into a beautiful Osaka in autumn time, and then they go through a number of different challenges. But in the end of the day, what they're discovering is just different ways of using the Pixel phone. And different Google apps throughout that journey. So it's made as a scavenger hunt, but in the end of the day, it's all made into an entertaining experience so that you can experience the product in the most natural or kind of like entertaining way as you can. And the third point that I would want to point out is that, related to the second one, if you think as an editor, what would they publish? Then you will also craft experiences that they can immediately create content from, right? Because that's then the backdrop of your decision making. Very oftentimes, even if they don't care necessarily about the product or the brand, if the experience is so interesting, they will join anyway, because they know that their audience cares about it. And I think those are the kind of the mindset that will hopefully get you to the answer. So it's not always necessary to have a big budget. Like that myth should be also taken aside, because it's more about creativity and embracing the fact that there is this creative talent that has figured out how to gain so much reach on those platforms, but also has reach among my audience. So how do I work together with them rather than impose them the rules that I think should be followed?
Right. So that kind of answers the fact that it should be a collaborative process between agency and influencers, as opposed to dictating how a campaign is to be curated. Would you say so?
Definitely. Absolutely. I agree.
So you talked a little bit about TikTok and of course Byte. I'm trying it. I'm as a marketer, I'm like it's hard enough trying to get clients to understand Instagram. It took forever for, at least for Malaysia, for Facebook to move to Instagram and to other platforms. Now you have TikTok, then you have Byte. Obviously TikTok and Byte very similar. I would say quite similar. And you have people who want to engage different sort of like spectrums of their target audience. So with these sort of platforms coming up with new sort of like ways of engagement, and even time frames, right? I think TikTok is only a few seconds, while Instagram is like a minute. How do you go about making sure that you find the right sort of influencers for all of these sort of social media platforms? And do you think that like if I'm an influencer and I'm strong on say Instagram, especially now with over lockdown, you see a lot of more influencers moving into TikTok and trying their luck with Byte. Do you think that sort of like their content can, or their charisma, or their sort of like reach can be replicated to all these different platforms? That's my. I know it's a lot to digest, but that's how I'm like thinking. Like questions that I ask.
So I think for marketers and brand owners, the number one thing to think about, my point of view is that you don't need to be on every platform. My good friend, now he's moved back to Europe, but he was looking after Chanel in the region, right? So you could think of that as the like epitome of like this family-run business of luxury, et cetera, et cetera. My point to him was always like, why the hell are you on Facebook? Everybody's on Facebook. Like, why are you there? You're delivering scarcity. Like that's basically your thing is about desire. And I think this is the example that I would also draw to other brand marketers, is that it really depends on the audience. Now we have data, for example, from Simon Kemp, who runs a great research study every year on how internet and social consumers, social behavior is changing on these platforms. And we already know that there's a big overlap between these different platforms. TikTok definitely gravitate towards a younger audience today. The older ones are growing very fast, but I think that the jury is still out on whether it is suitable and a good platform to engage beyond 30 even. At this stage, below 41% of the audience is below 24 years old.
Right.
So this gives you an indication of purchasing power. This gives you an indication of what do they generally look out in terms of content. So I think that I'm more of the advocate that as a brand, again, think of what is the appropriate context and also the platform for your audience. And you don't need to be everywhere. I don't think that anybody can master so many different platforms at the same time. I would rather start from doing one really well and then looking at extensions rather than the other way around, that you try to kind of tick all the boxes. So TikTok is, but having said that, I personally, I think TikTok is very, very innovative in many different ways. There's some philosophical concerns that I have on the long term of teen mental health and such, but as for marketers, it is clearly proven to be very, very sticky to the audience, and I think that it will be a great case study for years to come of a company that has came from APAC, from Asia, and has kind of ruled over the world. And we already see signs of that. I think actually my prediction is that it will take over Facebook Messenger as the biggest social platform by the end of this year.
Really?
And I think so, because last numbers we have were like end of last year they had 800 million monthly active users. At that time, Messenger had around 1.3 billion. And I think that their kind of stickiness, the product stickiness to make up for the difference is far greater. I think that we will see TikTok rise, and also the hires that they're making is incredible.
I've seen
the investments that they have, the profitability the business already has from years and years of doing their other businesses in China is incredibly interesting. And I think that we will see great things from that company. I just hope that they also kind of embrace some of the other things that are broken, I think, with the rest of social media. But let's see. It's a young team, I think, even though ByteDance in itself is kind of already established, and TikTok is a relatively new setup in as far as I understand. So this is my kind of recommendation for the marketers, is like, don't get confused by thinking that if there's a new new and shiny toy out there that you must have it. It is not always necessary. Also, for a lot of brands, to be very frank between us, TikTok is off limits because it's not brand safe.
Yep.
The variety of measures that the industry has put in place on Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of these places, you have a variety of metrics where you can exclude certain categories altogether, that your ads are not going to be displayed in certain context, whereas TikTok is still building those features. So I think for a lot of them, they're still like, it's just off limits for a lot of big brands.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, with COVID changing the world as we speak, what do you predict it would be like the next steps for influencers to remain a big part of the marketing mix? There were articles talking about how influencers have lost a lot of their revenue because of what's happening around the world with COVID, and that's understandable. But as with everything, they will bounce back. But for them, what would you say would be their next steps in terms of realignment for their brands to engage with corporate brands and to be part of marketing mix?
Oh, that's a very difficult question.
I know, which is why I'm asking you.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I wish I would have an answer. I think the big picture is such that I feel sorry for a lot of the creators. Like, a lot of them have made living out of this industry, and last time I checked, 80% of their income on a monthly basis comes from brand deals.
Yeah.
So a lot of people think that, oh, it's Facebook it's YouTube ads, but it's actually not the case. The weird thing is that in China, the big revenue source for influencers is the virtual coins. So that's something that TikTok is also trying to introduce and is introducing through their influencers. So that could change some things, because that means that it's kind of like a Patreon link, where you can have a micro transaction sponsoring your influencer that you care about, which I think is a very healthy dynamic. Like, I think it's a good thing if that's the revenue source, because it's kind of the comparison between a subscription model versus an ad-based model, right? Facebook is ad-based, whereas something else, a newspaper, Wall Street Journal, something else might be subscription-based. You might argue that the premium site is obviously the publisher there, the actual guys that are in the newsroom.
Right.
So also for influencers, we might see these sort of dynamics, because obviously if that big brand component is kind of falling apart, or it has actually, now I think it's returning again, but still a big chunk of their revenue was in hospitality, travel, hotels, like everybody who wants to be top of mind of moving people around. Events also do a great deal. So all of that is kind of put aside for the foreseeable future. So I hope they will survive. I think they need to look at alternative methods of financing themselves. I know a lot of people have looked for jobs. Well, tough luck.
It's not easy.
Live like the rest of us.
I know.
You need to live. So you need to live like the rest of us. Nobody will pay you for looking great. So I think that's the
rest of the common people. I call it. Sorry, go ahead.
Exactly, but there is a silver lining there, and I think that sort of normalization of the industry was much needed, and it was overdue. There was a lot of weird kind of reporting on how people are doing some crazy stunts just to get more engagement, and I think generally, if you see that a lot of teens increasingly are saying that all they want to do in their life is to become an influencer. I think we've kind of lost the script as a society, like as humanity. I think that, like, I'm a big advocate of, sure, you could have talents as an actor, and then by all means, if that's the thing you want to do, absolutely go for it, and don't worry about anybody else. But I think for a lot of people, it just became this sort of vanity thing to pursue, and I hope that COVID actually kind of brings us down to a little bit of normality. So I personally, that's what I hope to see. I think from a marketing and brand perspective, like there's no doubt in my mind that everybody wants more authentic messages. That if you craft and polish too many things, then in 2020 it will not be as successful as something that is a little bit rough around the edges, but it's genuine, it's real, it has heart and soul. So I think that's the world that I hopefully will see, and will become more widespread.
Oh, cool. Well, you kind of answered my last question, which is predictions about how the landscape is going to change. But I'm just going to touch base on one of the things that you talked about earlier, which is live streaming, right? The whole thing it's huge in China for sure. But is there a reason why it hasn't translated to like places like Singapore and Malaysia, where they sell products utilizing, say, really beautiful women? Of course, during 11/11, I think Alibaba sold like $1 billion in an hour or something like that. I can't remember. But is there a reason why it hasn't really translated to the other markets, but only China per se?
Yeah, good question. I've asked a lot of that myself. I think it has to do a lot with it has to do a lot with the platforms that we have, and it's unfortunate, but where we started this conversation about having a more fragmented kind of social media space, where we had, like, I remember, we used to work a lot on Loyat, like every day almost. It was like just checking into Loyat, and same thing in Singapore with Hardware Zone. They're still around and they're still strong, but they're certainly much smaller than they used to be in terms of relevance. And I think that what's happened with the big platforms is that they've kind of become very comfortable at where they are. I think the thing a lot of people don't understand about China, and this is also my foreigner's kind of perspective, is that there's so much more variety than people understand. There's the live streaming industry in itself, as far as I know, has so many different vertical apps. So if you're in beauty, then you use this live streaming app, and then if you're in cars, you have this other one, and then you have someone in real estate. So you have bigger players as well, but there's a lot of this sort of diversification, and I feel like the other big component is the monetization mechanics. So how do you make sure that creators actually get their fair share? The same fact that we talked about 80% coming from brands. I honestly, if you ask me as a part of the marketing team, like, is that fair? I don't think it's good for anybody. I think that they should have a good chunk of money that actually, or income that comes from their audience in one or the other way, and because that's the only way how they can empower. They're empowered to actually decide for themselves what is best for my audience, instead of taking this brand deal that maybe I don't even want to talk about, right? So I think that will create a better ecosystem for everybody. And TikTok, with virtual coins came from there just very recently. Haven't seen really widespread use for it, but in China it's a big monetization aspect. YouTube has been paying their creators for a long time, but it has also only very recently become, I would say in the last like 1 or 2 years, it's become really like a lifeline for some creators. But it's really a small amount of people that actually are able to sustain themselves with those incomes, and that usually means you need at least 1 million subs. Like you need at least a couple of like in the higher hundreds of thousands, and I think that plays a big role right now. What is interesting is that this year, I'm not sure if you noticed, but Facebook has been making some decent changes. They introduced Facebook Pay very late last year. It was a very small announcement, but it was meaningful in a way that that's the infrastructure that builds the payments into WhatsApp that they launched in India and Brazil. And I think presumably that will also empower a lot of the other mechanics. So in Instagram, also you have Instagram shops now, which is interesting, right? Because what they're trying to create is this sort of ecosystem that you don't leave Instagram for any other place such as Shopee or Lazada. You can create that, you can fulfill that transaction within that ecosystem. And I think a big part of that is figuring out the payments, because obviously APAC's payments landscape is not as simple and not as straightforward as you have in Europe or US.
Yeah.
And here you need to have a variety of different ways. Cash
Right.
on delivery, for example, is,
Correct.
you know,
Correct.
not really something nobody does in US, etc. So I
Yeah.
think like once they figure that out, and there's and honestly, I think TikTok's growth is healthy pressure for this industry. We will see greater things for everybody, and especially for consumers, and hopefully that will manifest in better features as well.
That's good. So one last question, nothing to do with, well, maybe nothing to do with influencer marketing, but what does the word change mean to you? I know it's very
Change.
open ended, but what would you define change? Maybe in your industry, you know?
Right. I think change to me means being fearless. I think that's what it kind of embodies, is the fact that we're all mortal, so to say, in our existence, and there's no time to be afraid.
Yeah.
And I think that's what change to me means, is that there's obviously everybody should be respectful and courteous, but change is everywhere. It's in nature. It happens all the time.
Right.
We can't stop it. So
Yeah.
let's just live with it. I
That's
think
true.
that's my kind of philosophical way of looking at it.
Yeah. So, well, I guess that's pretty much it. You know, in terms of the questions that I have. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I think you know, it's definitely insightful. It's allowed me to think differently in terms of some of the approaches that I've had with our clients. I'm probably trying to get them to watch this video to see, you know, so that I can sort of get them to go, no, it's just not me. There's an expert who agrees with my thinking as well. So, so I hope that, you know, I hope it's been an interesting chat as well.